Participles. In this chapter, we're going to look at Hebrew participles, specifically the active participle. But before we do that, I thought I would introduce participles in general. What exactly are these things? Well, a participle is a verbal adjective. And it's called a verbal adjective because it has features of both a verb and an adjective. And basically what you do is you take a verb and use that as your base, and you add adjective endings. So in form, it's very much like an adjective. And so we'll use the same grid that we used for adjectives and also nouns. If you remember, we had masculine and feminine, and then we had singular and plural, and participles have no dual, so you don't have to worry about that. So we'll have a masculine singular participle, we'll have a feminine singular, we'll have a masculine plural, and we'll have a feminine plural. Now, participles have no person. Okay? Remember, verbs, like the perfect paradigm, for instance, had basically this grid for the third person, and then it repeated this grid for the second person, and then had a truncated form for the third person because there's no gender in the first person. So you had this 3 times. But participles do not have person. No such thing as a third person participle. It's just masculine singular or feminine plural or whatever. So participles are similar to adjectives in their form. They use the same endings. We'll see that. So the bits that go on the end are the same as what we have in adjectives, so that's nice. And not only are they similar to adjectives in form, they're also similar in function. Not identical, but similar. If you remember, with adjectives, we had these 3 functions or these 3 uses. You could have an attributive adjective, a predicate, and a substantive. And if you've forgotten this, it may be a good idea to go back and review Chapter 9. Chapter 9 was where we looked at adjectives, because there are a lot of similarities. And it'd be good to have that fresh in your mind before you move into this. Just to recap briefly, we'll go into this in more detail next couple of modules, but attributive is where the adjective is functioning as a modifier, or modifies a noun, or something else. And a predicate is where it's functioning as a predicate adjective. It's connected to a verb, as a verb to be implied. And substantive is where the adjective is used as a noun. And we'll see similar things, especially these 2 will be similar for participles, a little bit different over here. The predicate participle is functioning more like a true verb with the participle. But we'll take 1 module each for these, so we'll go into those in detail. So participles are similar to adjectives in form, same endings, function, these 3 functions. And the last thing I want to talk about here is voice. As I said, we're going to look at the active participle. So what does active mean? Active and passive are something that we call voices. And maybe it's best just to look at an example. Voice. The example of the active voice is the king is judging. And the counterexample for passive would be the king is being judged. So what is the difference here? In both cases, we have a subject, the king. Here, the king, this is our king here, the king is doing the judging. So the king is doing the action, doing the verb. Down here, the king is not doing the action, the king is not judging, the king is being judged. So the king is receiving the action. That's the essential difference between active and passive. And our terminology here makes sense. Passive meaning the subject is passive. The subject is not acting. The subject is being acted upon. And here, the subject is acting. The subject is active. So it shouldn't be too difficult. These terms, if you haven't come across them, these are logical terms for describing these different types of action. If you've had Greek, you'll be aware of the middle. Greek has something called the middle, and what the middle is basically what we call a reflexive in Hebrew, and that's where it's a bit of a combination of these 2, where the subject is acting upon him or herself. So it's a bit like the active because the subject is doing the acting, It's also like the passive because the subject is receiving the action. It's really a combination of the two. There's another thing we'll look at in Hebrew in due course, and that is something called the reciprocal, where two or more entities are acting upon one another. So we have active, passive, and then we have reflexive and reciprocal. Now these ones here, reflexive and reciprocal, I'll talk about them later. We'll deal with them as we encounter them. They're dealt with a little differently in Hebrew. But I just wanted to introduce them to you here. If you've been exposed to them before, we will come across them, just not yet. But participles, we can have active participles and passive participles. And in this chapter, we deal with active ones. This is chapter 16. And in chapter 21, we will look at passive participles.